Hello and happy Wednesday, everyone. Welcome to the American Family Insurance DreamBank, where we believe in the transformative power of dreams. I'm Hannah, Dream Curator here at DreamBank, and on behalf of our team, we are so happy to have you with us today. For those of you who have attended our virtual or in-person events in the past, we welcome you back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'd love to take a quick moment to introduce you to DreamBank. So here at American Family Insurance, we believe that communities are stronger and the future is brighter when people are actively pursuing their dreams. That's why we created DreamBank, an inspirational community destination and digital experience dedicated to all you dreamers everywhere. From our daily event series to our immersive signature programs, our goal and hope is that there's something out there for every dreamer. Our offerings are designed to help you celebrate your dream journey, overcome obstacles, and stay motivated. This afternoon, I have the honor of introducing our featured speakers from Group Health Cooperative of South Central Wisconsin, Shannon Jegla and Dr. Rudy. Shannon has worked as a physical therapist at Group Health for 5 years, including the 2.5 extremely long years of the pandemic, which she feels taught her a lot about working within the healthcare system. Throughout her years of practicing, she has focused on the overall wellness of patients and working on the outcomes of their health instead of just treatments for their problems. Dr. Rudy also comes from GHC, where he has been practicing naturopathic medicine for a decade. His story into medicine is a little different than you might expect. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a degree in chemical engineering. After some years with some career dissatisfaction and a major injury to his vertebrae that left him in the hospital and learning how to walk again, Dr. Rudy spent some time thinking about the changes he needed to make in his life. He decided that he needed to take maybe some of his health in his life a bit more seriously, not only focusing on his physical health, but making decisions about his life that were more authentic to him. He says that once he was exposed to the world of meditation and yoga, his whole life changed. He started his own private practice in 2009 and has since been focusing on creating transformations within his patients, taking a more progressive stance in medicine that focuses on more of the overall outcomes in the people he sees. We are so excited to have both of them here today to talk about the impacts of everyday stress on your body and ways to enhance your overall well-being. So if you have any questions throughout the event, leave them in the Q&A section and we'll get to your questions at the end. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our fantastic speakers this afternoon, Shannon Jegla and Dr. Rudy.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Hannah. That was amazing. And so today we have kind of this privilege of talking with you about a topic that Dr. Rudy and I have probably poured over quite a bit, which is kind of the stress response and how our body and mind kind of handle that. And we figured this was a pretty timely discussion based on kind of trends we've been seeing in light of the pandemic for the last several years. And really with the focus on how can we take control of our wellness when there are other things that are seemingly kind of out of our control. So outside of the clinic, Hannah, if you kind of move on to the next slide, we thought we would kind of at least kind of shed some light on who we are, even in light of Hannah's excellent introduction. We're both animal people. I have a golden retriever named Annie that I do therapy work with when I'm not in the clinic practicing physical therapy.
Hey everybody, it looks like according to Hannah, I'm live too, so I hope people can see me okay. And I did notice that we have quite a few participants today, and it's too bad that I can't really look at everybody and your beautiful faces and get to know each of you in person. All the same, I hope that this next 45 minutes of time together will amount to some kind of meaningful discussions with some kind of key take-home lessons or messages or encouragements for you to just kind of be able to approach life, including health, in a more nimble fashion, especially given what the whole world over, all of us have kind of had to deal with. And so anyway, as Shannon was saying, we are animal people. On pictures, my dog Lincoln, he was adopted probably 9 years ago, and from a second shelter. So I count my lucky stars that I feel like he adopted me. I didn't adopt him. So so anyway, we can probably move on to the next slide and get to the nitty-gritty of today's talk.
Yeah, so what we kind of wanted to start with here today is to kind of set the framework for what we're kind of hoping to achieve by the end of this time together, which is giving you some understanding of your body, how it heals, your nervous system, and how it works. And I think, especially when we talk about tissue and, your, more physical body, that's what I work with every day. I think it's really important to kind of think about tissue does heal, right? You may have an injury to muscles, ligaments, tendon, but we know, and science supports, that over time, those tissues heal themselves. And I kind of provided some nice general timelines there on those things. But oftentimes in my clinical practice, there's a lot more healing that needs to take place outside of just what is happening structurally. And I think it's kind of neat in this kind of chart here to look at the healing timeframes are not one, every bone heals at 8 weeks. There's a range there, and that is really person dependent and involves a lot of other factors. So kind of hitting home that there are other aspects of healing that contribute to that process. And I think that's kind of why we work in more of that biopsychosocial model, looking at those kind of 3 circles meeting and all of the things that go into overall health and wellness. And that is kind of what I talk about every day.
Thank you, Shannon. And also, I think Shannon and I, in recent years, have collaborated quite a bit. And I think it just sort of happened maybe rather organically. I think, patients who are curious enough to kind of take a step back from their immediate health predicament naturally would be more curious about, asking the questions of what else can I do? And I think that it's very important for people, patients included, to really sit with a situation rather than immediately react to make that situation maybe palatable. I know that we talk about injury as being pain as being sometimes the impetus to seeking a provider, but we often don't realize, especially in lay population, that stress is painful and stress is injurious, and progress with no clear kind of mitigation plan, clear holistic kind of approach to living with stress, not making stress go away per se, because stress never goes away, but understanding that your framework really makes a huge difference in terms of what you can do and how your providers can best kind of meet your needs. And I like kind of these kind of Venn diagram thing, because it really makes me think of also another triad that I often would kind of draw for patients, and I would explain how their physiology is really comprising of nervous system, their endocrine or hormonal function, and then their immune system. And these 3 seemingly unrelated regions of our body talk to each other all the time, and that you can understand nervous system in terms of maybe more practically your brain function, and how that brain connects with spinal cord and all the peripheral tissues, where that you can electrify to do something, right? To move, to walk, to talk, to eat and whatnot. But the endocrine system that has a kind of a longer, long-term kind of a function associated with it. So think of nervous system as how you operate on a more immediate basis, how you basically manage to live your daily existence and nightly existence when you sleep. And the hormonal system, hormonal milieu, is how we can age gracefully, how we can adapt to the various rites of passage in our life with again, resilience. And the immune system has a more sort of like kind of nebulous way of operating behind the scenes, but its primary tasks really in an ideal setting, not in modern world, and I'll explain that in a little bit, is to mitigate immediate harm. And think of immediate harm as an infection, but also if we are still hunters and gatherers, potential predators looming around the neighborhood, or if you're any of the wildlife creatures out there, kind of advocating for your safety. This is where stress comes in, understanding stress, because we are largely mammalian creatures. When we are stressed, we very much trigger the alarm, however false, that there's something imminently harming us. So we can never afford to take stress lightly, because when we do not understand why we feel stress, how we feel stress, we are bound to react rather than respond. And it's in that reactivity, especially in today's culture, that leads people down the path of chronic stress response and or chronic pain syndrome. So I think I don't want to scare anybody away. So let's just stop there, because there's a lot of hopeful message waiting on the other side of this discussion.
Absolutely.
And I experienced it firsthand, because I lived through my youth and my 20s and 30s and jumped through enough hurdles in life, survived enough losses in life, dealt with enough disappointments in life, seen the world either underwater or on fire, right? I mean, so I'm just like any person next to me that, we're just humans. But I think Shannon and I are excited today to kind of at least help expose you to maybe areas where you can really develop your own sense of self that can help you not just survive anything, but live in a thriving way.
Absolutely. And I think, that leads really nicely into kind of our next slide, about having some basic understanding of what this nervous system or that acute stress response looks like. When we're talking about our nervous system and the stress response, that sits within primarily our autonomic nervous system. These kind of bodily and mind functions that happen at a very primitive level. It's very innate since creatures first walked the earth, right? Whether it was like a saber-toothed tiger running after them, or a wildfire coming towards, we needed to respond to that very efficiently. And we still have that response that is hardwired in us and works across all of those systems that Dr. Rudy was mentioning, our endocrine, our immune system as well. But our stressors look perhaps a little bit different in these days. So thinking about how our sympathetic branch responds to a potential stressor, whatever that looks like, and triggers that kind of whole body systemic, is what we call it, fight or flight response. But if we live our life there, we start to see some of those injurious kind of chronic things that linger, and that Dr. Rudy and I see a lot in our clinical practice. And what we really hope for you to get out of today is, how can we move beyond that, kind of come back down to our rest and digest state, kind of driven by that parasympathetic nervous system, where we can grow and socially engage and recover. We need to be able to move very fluidly between the two on our day to day.
Great.
And that kind of, go ahead, Dr. Rudy.
No, go ahead. You were going to say something.
And that, I think, kind of sets us up for what happens when that goes haywire. So if we kind of move on to our next slide, we can kind of see that over time, when we end up living most of our time in that sympathetic drive, our body becomes really good at what it practices, right? We start having those hormonal changes and those nerve connections, those neural pathways that makes our system very ready and alert to jump back into that again. I kind of use the example with my patients of, at rest, our nervous system is kind of like an alarm system. And if someone were to break into our front door or break through our window, we want that alarm system to go off. We want it to alert us to action. But when we have spent so much time being stuck in that kind of heightened, elevated state, we could have a dog bark outside or, a tree branch hit the window and that alarm system goes off. That response is kind of exaggerated. And it's very hard to try to engage with other people or focus on learning and growth when we constantly feel like we're on the edge of our seats, whether that's, through our mind or our bodies feel that as well.
And I'm going to add that much of from the earliest slide, we don't have to go back, but there was a mention of sympathetic and parasympathetic function. Actually, within those two worlds, it's actually, they represent three different ways we cope. And the primary way through the sympathetic function is from the, I believe that's like a T1 to L2 region, that sympathetic chain of our spine, that often gear us towards action. So that you have two choices in primitive setting of fighting, which is aggression, or fleeing, which is avoidance. All of us probably in different times in our lives have kind of experienced something along that line. And it's interesting when I earlier pointed to the fact that some people will ask this question, what else can I do? Ironically, when people need to really begin addressing long-term healing, much of the healing is from being rather than doing. And I can explain a little bit more down the slides as to what encompasses doing, what encompasses being, and much of it is what I learned through yoga, meditation, mindfulness, because we are a very action-based society. So it's kind of like outside our comfort zone to look at a problem differently, let alone addressing it differently. But when you learn to really begin existing outside your comfort zone, that's where your growth zone is. I'm not asking anyone to go so far that they move into a terror zone, I call it. It's like when I teach yoga, I ask people to kind of give their body a chance to take the front seat and let the mind take the back seat. And that's really what healing often entails, because in the parasympathetic end of things, you have the function of either withdrawal. And when you excessively engage withdrawal, you can see instances where an animal is injured, they need to withdraw. They need to go hide in the cave and the bush until they heal. But humans who are subject to chronic stress response, their demonstration of withdrawal looks more like depression, more like despondency, just shut down behavior. And that is a clear sign of over-engagement of the same unskillful way of coping, because it's habitual. So we don't put a lot of thought behind it. And the other version of the parasympathetic over-engagement looks like people who don't know how to say no, and they cater to everybody's needs, and they yield to socio-political situations, and that kind of victimized state of just kind of doing everybody else's bidding and not ever having to sit with yourself and ask the questions like, who am I authentically, and where am I coming from? What am I meant to do on this planet, and so forth. So we want to, between Shannon and I, we just kind of want to introduce patients to a hidden path to engaging a body that is as self-healing as possible, and that is through the hidden path of flow, and that flow is kind of, I think we use the word flow instead of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and that flow actually is tucked in that ventral or the front side of the vagal nerve, and that has to do with the way we relate to one another. The way how in this society more than ever, we really need to count on each other to show up, to really be supportive, to exhibit what therapists call unconditional positive regard, to practice listening skills, to really be like a dog, essentially, to one another. I think, I think I'm driving the point home here. If anyone has a question, you can type it in, and I think Hannah can filter it. But I think that makes sense, right, Shannon? Anything?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I think, and that's why I liked the, that arrow on that slide, because it kind of shows that we need to be able to move in both directions, right? We need to both activate and make sure we're not always withdrawn or shut down all the time. And I think that can be an uncomfortable journey to embark on, trying to learn into that flow. And, I think in the traditional medical model for years and years, we've really tried to mask symptoms or shy away from this approach. And I think, a prime example that Dr. Rudy and I have talked about is certainly the opioid crisis. And, what we have learned is drugs alone do not cause healing, right? We have, if there was a pill that we could all take to take all of our pain away and all of these other things, I think science would have found it by now. But we see that there are so many drugs on the market, and yet we're still developing new ones because we haven't found kind of the key to all of it. And I think it doesn't exist in medication alone. It doesn't exist in surgery alone. We have to kind of look within ourselves a little bit as well. And so I'd like to maybe take a moment for everybody to kind of to check in with themselves about this topic. Hannah, if you would move on to the next slide. This is a conversation I love to have with my patients, is how do you know you're stressed? Because you do know it. Your body knows it, your mind knows it, but it manifests in each of us a little bit differently. I call it your stress signature. A lot of my patients come in, they say, oh, my neck has been really bothering me. And I said, well, what has changed recently? And they're like, I've really been under a lot of stress at work, and I feel it all in my upper traps. I've really been clenching my teeth and my jaw is really bothering me. Those are more of a physical stress signature, your body's way of holding on to that stress response. But we see it vary person to person. It could be emotional in terms of sadness, or behavioral in terms of anger, and someone kind of lashing out if they're in that chronic stress response. We've all been guilty of having those moments where we feel kind of like a short fuse. For in other cases, it might be a little bit harder to come to the surface. Perhaps it's chronic GI issues, right? Digestive issues. And that's where, when I'm working with a lot of my physical musculoskeletal things, and my patients are dealing with other issues, I send a lot of my patients to Dr. Rudy to kind of work through some of those maybe GI related symptoms or other symptoms. But I just kind of want you all to think about, how do you know when you're stressed? What is your stress signature? I think it's having that insight and being able to recognize that is usually kind of the first step in being able to move towards, how do we address it? When do we know when we need to work into that flow?
And I think in relating the stress signature back to the physical body, and how physiologically or psychologically or behaviorally we exhibit this telltale signs of chronic stress, it's also curious to see how the sympathetic response often is has a implication on the cardiovascular health. People who are engaging that fight or flight response all too often will see this incremental functional increase in blood pressure left unchecked over time, that's what hypertension is, right? When think about the amount of stress hormones circulating in the body and essentially telling your body to run to safety or attack and neutralize the enemy, the people who lash out rather than reach out, right? I call it the bonobos versus chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are the ones that often think hierarchically and are more aggressive in nature. And the bonobos are the ones that are more about collaboration, coordination, and so forth, and cooperative. And I think I can only imagine for those of us who are more like bonobos, me included, to pretend that we are chimpanzees in the world. That alone can really backfire physically for us. So that's something I've come to terms with. I need to, even though the world around me might constantly put up this noise and trigger this lens of hostility, I call it, there are other ways to relate to any challenging situations. Again, as long as we have cultivated the skills to do so. The other pathway, the shutdown behavior and the yielding or fawning behavior, that those types of responses tend to show up in digestive issues. Constipation it's a great example for that. People who are chronically stressed, sometimes they develop chronic constipation because they're tense inside. Rather than being more explosive in nature, and they're more implosive, they harden themselves, right? They're being self-critical and taking, the weight of the world on your shoulders, that sort of thing. So I think, the mind body really are not two separate things. They're just windows into the same person. They're just different windows in the same person. So I think this is what makes collaborative model of care fruitful and ultimately more satisfying to providers, because no provider is a hero, but all of us are teachers, and that until we really engage patient in that collaborative model and get them to be their own teacher, right? I mean, most people wait until, I often joke with my patients, say, don't wait until those wheels are wobbling or worse yet, falling off before you really take a little bit more proactive stance on taking better care of your health.
Absolutely. And I think moving on to the next slide, Hannah, I do like to touch on, what is the definition of stress, and Dr. Rudy, I'd love to hear yours too, but at kind of a fundamental, it's the response to any demand, which I love to talk to patients about, because that is a very neutral definition. It's neither good nor bad. How we respond to a demand is ultimately whether that is going to be potentially harmful or adaptational, right? And would you agree, Dr. Rudy?
Yeah, that's one way. That's a good way to look at it. Feeling, drawing from my own experience living with the kind of residual pain of vertebral injury, it's interesting to be basically left with no choice but to sit with your body after you've been completely immobilized. And then for the next 6 months, I had to kind of really let my thoughts kind of settle, and drawing from that experience, and then through decades of practicing yoga very intently, and also using kind of the lessons I gleaned from personal practice and other from my kind of experience with guiding different yoga classes, I've come to realize that I think we tend to feel stressed when we look at a situation from, again, that lens of hostility, like something is coming at us, or that we find whatever we need to do demanding, imposing, and it's a different thing if you have to do something, however complicated, however labor intensive, cognitively involved. It's different if you really care about it. If you it's like wedding planning, right? For instance, for some people, birthday or whatever, or what have you. I think when you reframe what you do from having to do something to I get to do something, just that framework shifts your physiology so dramatically. So I often explain to people that it's important that your stress adaptation, first and foremost, entails how you look at what your situation has, pain included. I think all too often, and the reason why we got in the pain opioid crisis is not only because we have a heroic model of healthcare instead of collaborative health model, we also have kind of looked at pain only through kind of that nefarious angle, and not realizing your body at different points in time constantly try to talk to you, but in a very nonverbal way, because we develop a heart and a gut before we develop this cranium, the brain, and yet all three of them have to coexist as one unified person, that nervous system. And when you do something or you think about something and it's not in agreement with your heart and your gut, that's where stress is, right? It's a conflict. And so it's a conflict riddled type of existence. So it's important for us to be more selective. And also when we feel challenged, that we can develop better resilience when we look at it from a standpoint of something happening to us, and more like, what can I do? What can I do about it? I mean, creatively, how can I co-create with this situation? How can I sometimes out-create? I mean, so moving from vicious cycle of this habitual reactivity to a more virtuous cycle of skillful behavior. And skillfulness looks in, there's many ways human beings can be skillful. So, but that's for a different slide or a different discussion. So.
Yeah, and I think this is the appropriate time to kind of talk about maybe what you see, Dr. Rudy, in the chronic stress response on the next slide, Hannah, and the different ways that it affects the heart, the gut, the immune system.
Yeah, again, I'm not one to work from the place of fear, but I do like to kind of engage a conversation regarding how stress left unchecked can really lead to systematic dismantling of our health, and most evidently in the brain. People, interestingly, when we stress our body for too long, our glucose metabolism and our blood pressure function both kind of like also dwindle. And we have correlated increase in blood pressure and increase in insulin resistance to earlier onset or higher risk of dementia. There's a link in the slide. We don't have to go there to the study, but there was a study done on veterans, military veterans, and how PTSD is shown to correlate with a smaller brain volume. And your brain literally prunes itself when you're chronically stressed, to the point where your worldview is so tunnel vision that your existence is basically fear, stress, pain, and so forth. So it's important to understand how we need to encourage our body to live in a more expansive way, and to not be tunnel vision into our pain, to not associate pain with your identity, essentially. There's a book,
Absolutely.
a wonderful book. It's almost a mandatory read if someone has experienced, unfortunate events surrounding unexpected death, traumas really of any kind, childhood adversities and whatnot. That book, The Body Keeps the Score. A lot of people have heard of it. I'm glad that more and more people have come across that title. Chronic gut conditions, it's basically a lot of what I do in a clinical setting is trying to find connection between a lot of functional GI issues, as well as inflammatory bowel conditions that are necessitating more aggressive treatments. Any gut condition invariably has psychosomatic aspect of aggravation, if not onset. Hormonal imbalances, as I mentioned, hormones, your stress will lead you down the path of being more likely to develop hypothyroidism, pre-diabetes, if not diabetes. This thing called adrenal fatigue, which is just impaired response to stress, where your body literally gives up on responding to stress because it thinks you are a boy that cries wolf, essentially. It's like maladaptive behavior that leads to lower physiologic output to compensate. Infertility, and often I would sit down with a patient with this graph that shows you how the different hormones are produced by the body, primarily through the cholesterol in our diet, and how that is impacted. One thing that I forgot to include, I just learned recently, is vitamin D, which behaves like a hormone, is also dependent on cholesterol. Autoimmunity, this is so rampant. I think back when I started 12 years ago in my practice, we estimated autoimmunity to be roughly 1 in 3, but the revised statistics for 2030, I believe, is 1 out of 2 now. So our culture, our planet, is really a more and more, it's like self-harm is becoming kind of this dominant voice. And I don't mean like you would go out of your way and cut yourself, kind of self-harm, but I mean like the way we live, the way we eat, the way we relate to each other, it's all more and more self-negating until we wake up, until we realize, wait a minute, this is not good behavior, this is not conducive to healing. So hence our invitation today to help us kind of like foster a different way of relating, coping, and healing.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, all of those pieces of healing, there's so many of them that sometimes it can feel like kind of a mountain to tackle them all. But I think in my practice, I've even having people start with one thing like sleep hygiene or nutrition. Starting there, you can start to see how that rolls into other more beneficial patterns that kind of can help address some of those conditions. And I think on our next slide, you had kind of highlighted some of those with the Bredesen 7 and all of those different pieces of kind of mindfulness.
Yeah, the different, Dr. Bredesen is, I think, the pioneer in cognitive health. You know, we, since 1995, we've had hundreds. I think I made, if I recall correctly, I think there were over 600 drugs released since then for Alzheimer's, and not a single one turned out to be a magic bullet, as Shannon had kind of alluded to earlier. And we know by now, scientifically, clinically, there are these 7 areas that contribute to the elevated risk of dementia. And Dr. Bredesen had the wherewithal to ask the questions, why don't we address all these factors simultaneously? And so far, the clinical response over the thousands of patients have been very encouraging. Yeah, we don't necessarily cure Alzheimer's, but we can very impactfully halt the progress or improve their the cognitive measures and whatnot. And just goes to show your brain likes to be resilient if given the right tools. I mean, we are all built with resilience in a somewhere that we need to tap into. And just relating back to the pain, there was a little mention there how people with chronic pain will have disturbed sleep, and conversely, people who do not have good sleep schedule, quality and whatnot, will also have lower pain threshold. So that's kind of the aspect of it. I also want to mention something that Shannon mentioned earlier about resilience, and how in the Body Keeps a Score book, there's a mention of how yoga improves one's sense of equanimity in his patients who have dealt with trauma, PTSD patients. And equanimity in yoga is a very telling concept. It's basically a practice where that you arrive at when you learn to be less judgmental about what you're experiencing, and you move to a point of being a little bit more insightful as to how you got to whatever situation to begin with, basically a practice of being self-circumspect. And then you develop a lot of compassion, because then you realize, oh my God, I've experienced a lot on this planet. I've survived a lot. And I've been denied certain knowledge, right? Especially if in a kind of revolving door healthcare model where you have symptom, you get a script, or you go to pharmacy and self-treat yourself. But now you get to connect the dots, and you realize there's work to be done, but not the way I imagined it. And then you find equanimity, because now you feel more confident, and therefore you feel more, you feel less likely victimized by your health situation. You feel more like this as an invitation to, again, step outside your comfort zone and really wake up to your body.
I love that idea in yoga practice too. And it's something that, since Dr. Rudy and I have spent more time chatting, I have tried to kind of carry over into some of my like daily clinical practice in physical therapy of really challenging people to look inside their body and start to gather some insight on it. You know, a lot of times when patients are in pain and they come to physical therapy, the last thing that they want to do is move. But that's what our body was built to do. We were built to be moving. But oftentimes when I ask patients to kind of localize, like, where do you feel that sensation? What is that sensation? People have a really hard time localizing it, right? They're like, I think it's somewhere over in my shoulder. I don't know if it's an ache or if it's throbbing. We kind of lack some of that insight and that body awareness, and kind of helping people start to look within and find some of that body insight. And then knowing what, in my practice at least, like what is safe movement versus what could be potentially harmful movement in those early stages of recovery, helps people gain some of that confidence and that autonomy and start moving outside of the clinic, right? And for me, that's my ultimate goal, is I want my patients to come back in and be like, you'll never guess what I did this weekend, right? I went out and I hiked at Devil's Lake. And, you know, looking inwards a little bit more and having a little bit more body awareness.
Awesome.
So if we kind of move on to the next slide, I think this is a nice maybe representation of what Dr. Rudy and I were talking about in terms of the interconnectedness of body and mind too.
Yeah, and this is just an interesting kind of table of all the different regions of our brain that regulate basically cognitive function, emotional balance, and creativity, and sensory input, and all that stuff, and how each region is responsible for key aspects of brain function, but all of these regions are affected by pain. Where in acute setting, that means pay attention to the danger ahead. Naturally, you're not going to think about your knitting project that you set aside when you're in acute pain because you stepped on a piece of glass or something. But when pain becomes insidious and persistent and dysregulated in its purpose, it sort of like clouds over all aspects of our brain function. And this is the vicious cycle that is often poorly treated with medication alone, because some of these drugs actually give people brain fog on top of it all. So it's like, you're not gonna advance healing here. We need to teach people to bring their pain to an acceptable level. I also don't like people living with pain intensely all the time either. I'm not gonna ask them to grin and bear everything that they experience, because they need to transform, not grin and bear anything here. But they can get the pain down to an acceptable level. And then through PT, through mindfulness-based stress reduction, through sometimes hypnosis, what have you, people need to disengage the pain conversation so that it doesn't become this persistent source of terror in their existence. And therefore, it again, pain is injurious, including your brain function. So we have to learn to dissociate pain from the rest of our narratives.
And I think, how we put those different healing strategies into action is our next slide, Hannah. And I think that that's where a lot of what Dr. Rudy and I try to impart on our patients is centered. Is like, how do we move towards some of these strategies as opposed to just solely relying on some of the maybe the more, proposed magic bullet treatments, or just being isolated within kind of the traditional medical model, I should say, kind of trying to be less reactive, more proactive, so that when we are stressed, like we've said, that becomes potentially adaptational and not injurious, right, Dr. Rudy?
Yep. And in the same way that neurons do not really work well independently, right? I think it's also curious to contrast with the way we study up to this point scientifically, clinically, how to treat anything is this kind of petri dish science, where we try to replicate what's happening on a petri dish to actual humans with messy lives. And cells left to themselves more or less work in disordered fashion. And you look at heart cells, cardiomyocytes, they beat independently, but then you pull them together, and the more heart cells there are, the more they beat synchronously. And the study with addiction is another phase of stress. People who no longer cope normally, they seek external means to quell their dissatisfaction, stress, whatnot. And we learned this from the mice model, that mice left to themselves, they all became drug addicts, more or less, right? They become really prone to, so the gateway drug is sugar water solution, but then they become really hooked on other agents that keep them sort of like in a state of stupor or whatnot. And yet the mice that were let to live together, congregate together, and given basically a little miniature society, they are the ones that are playful and alive, and they are vastly more resistant to being addicted to these external means. There was a study done in 1950s at UW, Harry Harlow, who later gained fame through his study of parental affection with rhesus monkeys. Before then, he studied these adult rhesus monkeys, and how the monkeys that were initially given these complex interlocking puzzles, and they took to these puzzles like fish to water, and they were very happily engaging them and solving them. And yet the monkeys who were later incentivized with raisins, I think, they were the ones that performed more poorly. And not to mention, they didn't enjoy what they're doing as much. I think I'm trying to drive home two very important pieces of healing here. One is, it has to come from an intrinsic place. No one can wake you up if you don't wake up. As much as all of us, me and Shannon included, want to shake you. And secondarily, it's also not your battle alone. Don't make it into an upward hill battle. Don't make it into a boulder pushing project. Rely on others. Check in with others. We are interdependent creatures here. The world exists because of all the pieces in it. We're not in our own little petri dish trying to get healthy. It's never going to happen. We need to think a little bit more sort of interconnectedly, like, what's missing? If I'm going to eat well, how do I make it happen? It's not just resisting at every family function and social function the sugars that are everywhere. Maybe engage a different conversation, right? Enlist your family's help. I know that there a physician at a recent conference said that finally, after experiencing her level of burnout, she's like, I'm making my teenage children step up their game, help me with household chores, help with cooking, help with whatnot. To me, like, don't do it alone. It's not gonna happen. It's not a marathon. Don't turn it into like don't set yourself up to fail. That's all I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, kind of finishing up that, like exploring more some of those mind body practices, whether that is yoga or meditation or, body scanning practices, imagery, and then looking outside of our body to what has been provided around us, into nature, and using some of the beautiful examples of nature, as I kind of say, examples for our own healing sometimes. I don't know what you have to add to that, Dr. Rudy. Probably lots with your yoga background. I said, I don't know what you have to add to that, Dr. Rudy. Probably lots with your yoga background.
Yeah, I think, in the slide there's a mention of creativity, right? I think I'm less interested when I interact with patients in like what I think they should do. To me, it's more like I'm simply taking the active listening role to understand what may be missing in terms of what's a missing piece of knowledge that may help them connect to seemingly unrelated things in their lives. So I often, again, I have to kind of engage that conversation to arrive at their intrinsic motivation. I think there are many techniques that we can explore, but what are the best fit for the person? And that's, I think, the tricky part clinically. I think I'm very grateful between Shannon and I, and we spend a great deal of time with individual patients. Mm-hmm. I think that's the other element, is time. I think we are very often stuck on outcome. We think of health as something to get to. And in yoga, it's really a place of learning to always constantly arrive in your body, just actively arriving in your body all the time. And in doing so, you realize something that is happening incrementally can actually be very profoundly experienced moment to moment. I think it's much more, life affirming, and less sort of like, it just adds to the stress in our life to think that I have to get somewhere. Instead of just, if there's one word that represents well sort of like my own journey as patient, as well as a doctor, not like a hero doctor, but teacher, because docere means teaching, teacher. And it's gratitude. I think, like gratitude for curiosity, the way that you can sometimes kind of like hold a mirror to ourselves and say, what am I doing? And also gratitude that there are people in my life that care enough to help me implement my goals. Maybe not goals, but whatever steps, whatever's important to me, that there are enough supportive people. I think back to again, I hope that answers the question. I don't know if you indeed, but sometimes I just kind of go off a tangent. But yeah.
And I think maybe Dr. Rudy and I had planned for maybe a little bit of a practice of a mind body, but I think with our remaining time, I might like to see what questions have popped up in the chat. What do you think, Dr. Rudy?
Yeah, great. Either way.
Yeah, I say let's jump to the questions, and maybe Hannah, if you could go 3 slides ahead. I think this is kind of like, yes, this one. I think this is a good final slide quote to like leave up while we maybe see what questions we have.
Okay.
I think as we're waiting for questions, I can demonstrate quickly, since we got talking about the polyvagal response, and I did it just moments ago when we first got on air. One of the exercises that I plan on demonstrating takes at the most 1 minute. Usually people can do it for 2 minutes. It's based on this book by a bodywork therapist named Stanley Rosenberg. It's a very heady read. It's full of physiologic sort of like discussions on physiology. If you work in healthcare, it will be very interesting. If you are into, like academic content, but it's in the last third, actually, not the second, the last third of it, might be chapter 5, where, can you see it, Hannah, the book?
Yes,
Great.
I can see it.
Accessing the healing power of the vagus nerve. For the people who are more like a koala or sloth, that they don't want to do yoga as intently as I do, 90 minutes at a time, they can at least work on that gut-brain axis of their parasympathetic function. There's a little exercises on how to do facial massage, how to do salamander pose instead of cat-cow dog pose that people do in yoga. The one thing I was going to demonstrate is the one where you put your hands so that the shape of your palms, people who can't touch their hands tightly can just do one hand. You press your palms against your skull until you feel that shape cocooning your skull, and you lie on the floor flat. You don't move anything. You just rotate, you just look sideways, one side at a time for like 30 seconds, roughly 3 very slow cycles of breath. And then you move your eyes to the center and you move to the other side, 30 seconds or 3 cycles of very slow breath until you initiate either yawning, sighing, or swallowing reflex. For me, like just talking about it, I'm like pulling saliva because I love yoga and stretching and all that stuff. So it's like learning to disengage that sympathetic function that always like makes our brainstem ready to act, right? This is like ready to digest or ready to sleep. And really, it's something as simple as that, done repeatedly throughout the day, can help you just come back to yourself 1 minute at a time. Hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
There's also YouTube videos. Just type basic polyvagal exercise Stanley Rosenberg. People demonstrated it there.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
We have a couple minutes for some questions, but I have one from Aline, and she says that when she takes yoga classes, she often experiences a lot of physical pain. And then her question was, is it possible that some yoga postures and positions aren't beneficial for everyone?
Absolutely.
I feel like that's kind of exactly what you just answered.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are people that are just not meant to be. If you're a dog person, you like running outside, climbing and whatnot. If you're a cat person, you like probably curling up on the couch with a book, right? I mean, sometimes I just ask plainly, are you a dog person or a cat person or any other animal? Or are you prickly like cactus or whatever? But we have to find out what, to me, like the only plan that works is one that is proven not only beneficial to you, that you can work towards doing it in a, like that old toy, that the wheel that you tap only every so often, but otherwise it spins itself. That's what we are trying to arrive at between Shannon and I. How do you develop a plan where it's kind of seamlessly integrated? It's not this insurmountable goal. So yeah, I think if yoga doesn't work in certain way, yin yoga, otherwise there's Pilates, there's swimming, I don't know what Shannon has to say about that. Shannon?
Yeah, I always say, especially in more of the group yoga sessions, if there are certain positions that don't feel good to your body, you can break out from what everybody else is doing and move into a position that does suit you, right? Yep. Even if it means, everybody's in downward dog, but you're in child's pose. I think the practice is meant to meet you where you're at.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze 2 quick questions in because I think they're really good. One person asked, can you explain more about the correlation between vitamin D and stress from earlier?
Oh, it's not specifically to stress, and I just include a link. It's actually with cholesterol. And cholesterol is needed in the body dietarily to make all the hormones in our body, whether it's sex hormones or adrenal hormones or thyroid, whatever. Like there are a lot of hormones in our body that are not thyroid. Thyroid hormones come from amino acids, but a lot of hormones associated with aging well. And curiously, this is we live in a time where everyone's cholesterol is being treated by medication, even though half of people with bad cholesterol don't necessarily develop coronary events or heart problems. So it's just an interesting food for thought, if you will. We can't blame cholesterol for the problem here. Much of it has to do with how we live our lives and the decisions we make surrounding how we respond, again, to stress. And vitamin D is good for your brain health. So get some sunshine, not just through pill, if you will. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So here at DreamBank, we truly believe in the power of dreams and celebrate that our community is made up of fellow fearless dreamers like the two of you. So as we wrap up, we always like to ask this one question of our speakers, and that is, what is one piece of advice you have for someone who is pursuing a dream right now? And I will start with you, Dr. Rudy.
I think it goes back to finding, developing a position in your life where it's less about the pursuit and it's more about enjoying yourself thoroughly. Back to that rhesus monkey studies led by Dr. Harry Harlow, it's like your intrinsic motivation, your spark, your creativity, your joy, that's what you stick to. It doesn't matter. It's like, I imagine if I were Michelangelo, right? I'd probably be pretty bummed when I finished David, the statue, because then David became everyone else's to enjoy. But it's that process leading from the big slab of stone to getting to what you think you're making. That's where the gold of existence is. It's always been mine. I mean, to me, like the intimacy of life is the driving force. So learn to be intimate with all aspects of your life, because you'll learn so much from yourself and one another if we just build ourselves to be more capable of intimacy with every experience. Shannon?
So I guess I would say, you know, in the pursuit of a dream, I think, and life has taught us a lot in the last several years, that there are going to be twists and turns and bumps and barriers, and not giving up on the dream, but just changing your path is especially something that I have learned in the last several years. And then learning to, like Dr. Rudy said, learning to enjoy those challenges as you get to your dream can help you really, I think, get more fulfillment out of the process of getting there too.
Don't do it for the raisins.
Not the raisins, no raisins.
Oh, thank you both so much. I think one of the biggest things I took away, is something that we talk a lot about at DreamBank, is just building your dream team. So those people who are going to be around to help you get through those obstacles. And I feel like both of you touched on that a lot, of maybe building more of your medical team or your team that's going to help you overcome those obstacles. But I just wanted to say a huge, huge thank you to you, Shannon, and to you, Dr. Rudy, for taking time out of your very busy schedules and patience to come talk to us today. We really appreciate it. And I know a lot of people in the chat are very grateful for everything that you taught today. So I just wanted to say thank you to the both of you.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks everybody.
And Shannon for inviting me in the first place. So much gratitude.
Couldn't have done it without you, Dr. Rudy.
Oh,
yes.
We are bonobos, so not chimpanzees.
And then to everyone who's asking if there'll be a recording, we will be putting up a recording on our YouTube page. I put the link in the chat already, but you can also Google search it. It's just DreamBank at amfam.com. But to all of you who tuned in, we just want to thank you for joining us today. We look forward to continuing to learn and grow and dream together. You can learn more about upcoming DreamBank events and content designed with your dreams in mind at amfam.com/DreamBank and by connecting with us on our social channels. So on behalf of American Family Insurance and DreamBank, we look forward to hosting you all again soon. Until then, keep dreaming fearlessly and have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you all.
Take good care.
Bye.
Bye.